Well, thank you both to Dr. Xavier, Dr. Scheffler. I'll ask them to come up for our forum time and our question and answer time. And while they're getting settled in and we're getting some of the questions, let me simply try to summarize what I think you heard tonight and what the take-home measure is. Our body and what we call the human organism has taken hundreds of thousands, million years perhaps, to evolve to a state of both living with the internal organism and the external environment. Part of the problem, however, is that the facility by which we have developed ourselves as human beings over that time, including our SWAT team, if you like the immune system, has had to deal with social evolution over a much more rapid period of time. And the consequences of that are the complexity of the engagement between the gut, the external environment, the changing external environment, and this enormous flexibility of the immune system to, in many, many cases, be positive, but as you've seen here, in an accentuated state, be extremely negative, potentially even deadly. And it's in that context that the science, which has expanded dramatically, thanks to our two colleagues here today, in part with their colleagues, not only here in the Boston and Cambridge arena, but around the world, that have contributed to the understanding, and particularly the novel understandings that perhaps to many of you is new, and that is the microbiome as a almost living organ within an organ that is demonstrably associated now with wellness and illness. So in that context, again, I'd like to thank our speakers, and we look forward for engaging conversation. And I believe the way we're going to do this, as I understand it, is we're going to take questions from the audience read by Louisa.
The first question, and it's a good one, is, are allergies increasing in other countries at the same rate as they are in as the United States?
Wayne?
So for lack of a more appropriate term, westernized societies, the epidemiology is very similar, and that is also similar to non-communicable diseases of those societies, other immune-mediated diseases. We do see in places like China with urbanization that appears to be a risk factor for allergic disease. So it's happening with lifestyle changes around the world. The rates in westernized societies are higher still.
And I would remind everyone in the slides that Dr. Xavier showed you, there were distinct comparators in those environments that presumably have maintained lifestyle and environmental factors that perhaps go back tens of thousands of years with a much lower incidence of many of the diseases that we're talking about here today. So what was necessary for survival 20, 30, 40,000 years ago may have been dissipated in an environment that is now causing us much more hostility.
And the next question has to do with antibiotics and the interplay between antibiotics and allergic reactions.
Either of you? Wayne?
So, it's not allergic reactions to antibiotics, I presume. I think the question is there a relationship between antibiotic use or exposure and the development of allergies?
That's the question we'll answer in any case.
Interestingly enough, allergic reactions to drugs don't really fit general patterns of atopy so well, just as an aside. So there are relatively few studies that tease out antibiotics exposure specifically. There are a couple that I can think of that implicate their exposure in relation to eosinophilic chronic inflammatory disorders, but the broader pattern, the best epidemiology is what we discussed in terms of rural or farm lifestyle.
So I didn't show the extra slides, but in the same study that I alluded to in comparing the incidence of immune diseases, allergic diseases in Finland, in Estonia and Russia, in that same cohort, I have 20 children who have seen 20 or more antibiotics in the first 2 years of life. And I have 60 children who have not seen a single antibiotic in the first 2 years of life. the incidence of allergic or immune-mediated diseases in the children who have seen the antibiotics is 6 times higher than in the kids who have not seen any antibiotics in the first 2 years of life. And the hope is that we'll be able to, we're now beginning to study the microbiome changes and the immune system changes in these children. And the hope is that we'll be able to see sort of shifts in the microbiome community as you take antibiotics. So there was a very nice study done by David Relman at Stanford, where he took healthy individuals and then gave them a course of ciprofloxacin, which is a commonly used drug used to treat diseases like urinary tract infections. And he then followed the microbiome in these healthy individuals. With the first course of ciprofloxacin, it took about 6 weeks to get back to the normal microbiome. Then he challenged the same group of healthy individuals with a second course of ciprofloxacin. Now it took 14 weeks to get back to the healthy microbiome. When you gave the third course of antibiotics, they never got back to the normal healthy microbiome. So these are drugs that we commonly take that can clearly shift the balance, and by repeated exposure, the ability of the gene pool within the microbes doesn't allow you to get back to the healthy state.
A related early risk factor might be C-section birth, and there have been several studies that have related C-section birth with increased risk of allergy, and it's also recognized that infants born via C-section have a different pattern of colonization of both their skin and their gut.
So I think that brings back this incredibly important point, that the way we interrogate our own bodies in the 21st century over a matter of days, weeks, or months, we are overcoming millennium, tens of thousands of years of evolution in terms of symbiosis of our body to protect us during those periods of time. So we can do a lot of damage very quickly that lead to the accentuation of many of the acute and chronic illnesses that we're now talking about. Next question.
This is the last question that I want to open it up. And this is a question really on regulations and food labeling. Do you see, are you part of the conversation about changing food regulation to be more sensitive to, this particular question is added gluten, but other things which may be allergenic stimulants?
I have been peripherally involved most recently with an initiative to, for example, add sesame to a list of things that are currently covered by the Food Allergy Labeling Protection Consumer Act, but that's about the extent of my own involvement. It's been something where there certainly has been improvement over the years. Probably the most persistent clinical issue for my patients is the widespread use of voluntary labeling, the may contain traces issue. Unlike celiac, where there's been at least some progress in sort of identifying what might be minimal thresholds, the food allergy community has sort of lagged behind that. I am part of a 3-site study, an international study that's trying to better identify what is a sort of threshold of peanut allergen exposure that would be low enough to be safe in the majority of the population, and that would be then useful for industry. So that's about my own.
So I assume at this point we're going to open it up to the audience. And again, I think there's only one microphone here. We could pass this one around, but if anyone does want to come up to the microphone, please.
Hi, thank you for wonderful, helpful, enlightening presentations. Really appreciate it. Dr. Xavier, there was one slide that you put up that talked about treatment, and there was sort of a threefold. And this is sort of corollary, but you mentioned infection. And so I wondered about treating infection, and then hearing all this discussion about what can happen to the gut when treating infection. So how does that fit in the piece?
Yeah, so if you have a bacteria that causes disease, then it's, the recommendation is to treat that infection. But often what happens with antibiotics that are prescribed are for viral infections and or other non-bacterial infections. And in that setting, you end up having a large effect on the normal good bacteria that digest carbohydrates, make vitamins, and prevent the pathogens from coming in. So every time you take a course of antibiotics, there is clearly, the risk of changing the microbial flora. But usually when you design a drug that targets a specific pathogen, the effect on the normal community is significantly lower than when you take it for an indication that's not recommended, like a viral infection. So the classic studies have been children who have had recurrent ear infections. A lot of them got prescribed antibiotics. But then we later found out that majority of these ear infections are viral in etiology. So this was indications that did not require antibiotics.
I see. Okay. And probiotics, is this sort of part of?
So the
piece?
concept of probiotics is attractive, but one of the challenges is that the current probiotics in the market do not bring about a sustained change in the microbial community. So generally, it's good to take. I recently spoke at a meeting organized by the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. There were about 1,200 people in the audience, and one of the questions they asked me was, "What do I do about probiotics?" And my response was, "Continue to eat your yogurt and continue to eat healthy food, but don't waste your money buying capsules that contain probiotics."
What about fecal transplant?
So there is emerging evidence that in certain types of infections, so this is especially an infection that is becoming an epidemic where you've used antibiotics and you get a toxin called C. difficile that gives you a certain type of diarrhea. Now there is emerging data that if you can find ways of restoring the microbiome in these individuals, then you can prevent the toxin producing bacteria from staying within the system. So the FDA has not approved this as a treatment. You can get special permission to give this to patients with C. difficile colitis or C. difficile diarrhea that has not responded to conventional treatment. So even at Mass General, we've recently treated about 30 patients who have been close to death because of poor or incomplete control of C. difficile colitis. And all 30 of those patients have left the intensive care unit with, complete cure of their disease. But one of the challenges is one of the challenges is how do you identify the best donor? And how do you identify the patient or the individual with C. difficile colitis who is resistant to treatment? So we've initiated a large study now to sort of follow these patients who've got fecal transplant and those who have responded and those who have not responded to see whether we can identify resistance factors in those who don't respond.